Hi, I'm Andy Haxby. I'm a European entrepreneur and the director of a Dutch software company that conceived of the idea of fair trade software. And we ended up, almost by accident, helping around about 1 million people in Africa. And so I'd like to tell you that story. But first, let's look at the problem. Large corporations operating in Africa, such as the telco, they need the same ICT services as their counterparts in Europe, but they can't source that level of complexity of IT from the local market in Africa, because there are almost or very few companies who can deliver that level of complexity of IT projects, so everything gets outsourced. Meanwhile, African universities do turn out very high-quality graduates who are very motivated, and because they're connected to the internet, they can learn anything we can learn. But there are no jobs for them, or not enough. And so many of them, as an alternative to unemployment, start small companies with a lot of ambition, a lot of motivation. But in Europe, people who start companies tend to do that after they've worked in a larger organisation for a period of time. I worked 15 years in the oil industry before I started my company. And the Africans don't have that, often don't have that benefit of experience. And so, whereas we have the opportunity to learn best management practice and current thinking for example, projects management, a lot of these startups lack that. And as a result, they're constrained in their ability to undertake more complex projects. And a real big problem is that there's this gap of projects that are too small or low budget to outsource internationally, but too complex for local companies. And so in 2015, we decided to see if we could try and find ways to reduce this gap. And so my company in the Netherlands partnered with a German government development organisation called SEQA, and two small IT companies in Nairobi, Kenya. We started an initiative that we called Code Pamoja, and Pamoja is Swahili for together. So the idea was code together, where we get people in the Netherlands working in partnership with people in Kenya to teach them not particularly IT techniques and technology, because they could learn that themselves, but more to show them how we approach project management here in Europe. And that particular type of project management is called Agile. And a couple of years ago, I read an article in a newspaper about an Indian guy who was an artist, and I think this is the best example I have of the difference between traditional project management and Agile. So this guy, he was a street artist in India, and he met a Swedish woman who was a tourist on holiday, and they had a romance, but eventually she went back to Sweden, and he decided he wanted to go and join her. Now, in traditional project management, you think, okay, how can I do that? I can get a flight, I can get a train journey, a series of train journeys, I can work out a budget. Maybe the train journey is going to be cheaper than the flying, and so I can work out a critical path and the different steps I need to take, and then I can do whatever's necessary to raise the budget. But if you get halfway and miss a connection on the train, there's the potential that you never reach your goal, and all of your budget is wasted. So he didn't do that. Instead, he sold everything he had and bought a bicycle and just started cycling northwest. And the further he went, sometimes he'd stop and rest for a day and do some painting and earn some money. But the further he went, the easier it got. People heard his story, liked what he was doing, maybe gave him a lift or paid for a train journey. And eventually he made it to Sweden. And they recently celebrated, I think, 25 years of marriage. And he's a famous artist in Sweden. So that's the kind of Agile concept where you have a vision and you move towards it incrementally. And in software, we use a methodology in software development to do that, which is called Scrum. And so what we did, and Scrum's difficult to teach academically, you have to work with more experienced people who can act as mentors in order to learn how to do this. And so large companies that operate internationally, sometimes they'll have a team in one place and a team in another place, and they all use these Scrum project management techniques. But we realized that the Kenyans, it would be hard to get started, so we mixed the teams up, and using video conferencing tools and things, we had geographically mixed location teams with some members in the Netherlands, some in Nairobi. And so we just started working on some real software projects, but which we executed for free for customers because we didn't know whether this would work or not. And we just started teaching people. And what happened was we put 100 graduates in Nairobi through this program over a 2-year period. And they learned projects management. Many of them went off to get jobs. Some of them took jobs with our partner companies. Some of them started up their own companies. We needed counterparts in the Netherlands to work with them, and we did that with interns and undergraduates. And so around about 100 students in the Netherlands also participated in this, and they learnt a lot. They made friends. You know, I think it was really interesting for all of the people who were involved in this to realise that culture is increasingly not about a geographical basis that's vertically identified. It's, you know, there are horizontal aspects of culture as well, and geeks are geeks, and there's a global geek culture. And they all like the same films, they play the same video games or whatever. And so people made friends, and some of the Africans, when they got their first job, the first thing they did was save up money to visit their friend in Amsterdam. They also found new solutions to problems. Like in African culture, it's very difficult for an employee to ask their boss for something. It's just not a done thing, you know. But one of the things you do in this Scrum procedure we use in software development is at the end of every small iteration towards your goal, you do a thing called a retrospective, which is a meeting where you look back at the things that went wrong and try to figure out ways to improve them. And the Dutch team said to the Kenyan teams, or team members, you know, we could develop more software, we'd code more if you didn't take so long for lunch. Why do you guys take so long for lunch? And the Kenyans said, well, it's very hot here and there's no refrigerator in the office, and so we can't bring food to work because it's spoiled by lunchtime. So we have to walk to the shopping mall, and it's a long walk, and so that's why it takes a long time for lunch. So the Dutch guys said, well, buy a refrigerator. And they made an action point that came from the team that they would work better if they had a refrigerator. And that was given to the management team, who took that on board and bought a refrigerator. And that wouldn't have happened in a normal way without using these team-based communication mechanisms. So that was kind of interesting. What I found was much more interesting even, was what happened to the companies who we partnered with. So there were 2 small partner companies who ran the facilities in Nairobi while we ran the kind of training program from the Netherlands. And they learned as participation in this, and they used the ideas they learned in their own environment and on their own projects. And so, for example, there was a healthcare program. If people who live in the slum areas of Nairobi, they do have access to basic healthcare. So there are programs, for example, for pregnant women. But until recently, those healthcare schemes were run by volunteers and they used paper-based systems, and so they weren't very well managed, and you know, maybe things didn't get followed up. And because the service wasn't perceived as being very good by the recipients often didn't bother with the healthcare that was offered. But one of our partner companies worked on a project to digitize this, and because the quality of the service improved, more and more women then made use of the service and gave birth in proper medical facilities rather than at home in the slums. And so, you know, thousands of people have received better health care as a result of our partner and better understanding how to work with a customer, because health workers don't know how to scope an IT project, and so previously our partner company would have not known how to deliver something that would work for the customer, but they learned by learning Scrum how to work closely with the customer and deliver a better product. And the same is true of the other company got involved in a project. Health information is sometimes difficult, and so like sexual health education, HIV education is sometimes difficult to do in a good way in Africa. But the other company got involved in an initiative to create an online TV channel that produced healthcare videos and soap operas with important messages for young people. And that was quite a complex project, and they wouldn't have known how to do that previously. But through learning the projects management techniques that we showed them, they successfully delivered that. And in a third case, the person on the right here is a farmer from a rural area in Africa. And people living in rural areas need access to finance sometimes, maybe very small amounts of money, sometimes just to buy some fertilizer or fix some farm machinery or buy some farm machinery. But they don't have access to structured financial services. If they want to buy money, borrow money, they have to get it from informal moneylenders who charge absolutely exorbitant rates of interest and very punishing conditions for repayment of loans. And the banks would like to service those people, but the problem is it can take 2 days to travel out into a rural area to meet potential customers, 2 days back to the city again to make an offer, 2 days out again to go to the customer with an offer. So it's not a very easy way to work. But the guy on the left in this picture is Stephen Manor, who's the director of one of the companies we worked with. And learning what he'd learned about how to approach software development projects, he worked very closely with a major Kenyan bank to set up a handheld system that would cope with the difficulties of intermittent telephone connections in rural areas, so that the account managers from the bank could go out and make offers for finance to people in the field and sign them up for a bank account all on one day. And the result of that is that more than 750,000 poor people in rural areas in Kenya now have their first bank account, and tens of millions of euro in microloans has been distributed to these people. And that wouldn't have been possible if Steve hadn't have learned how to projects manage more complex IT projects. We have a problem in Europe as well. The problem in Europe is that it's often difficult to get graduates started. In my company for 20 years, we've had a problem with recruitment. If we recruit graduates, it's hard to start them on their first projects. If we try to recruit more experienced people, the competition in the market's too high. But through our involvement in this project, a lot of those interns who worked with us learned how we worked. They learned the basics they need to become full-time employees for my company. And so we've hired a lot of new people and suddenly become much more successful, I think, now than we've ever been in the 21-year history of my company. So this worked for us too. Now it's interesting that a lot of companies are thinking that you can set up an initiative in Africa or other developing countries where you give them micro work and you find people to do IT work in Africa for customers back in Europe. And they call that impact sourcing or offshore outsourcing. I don't think that's... it's admirable that they want to create jobs, and that's good, but if we'd have given Steve work for a customer in Amsterdam, he would have thought that was great and he'd still be doing that. And he wouldn't have used his knowledge and skills to solve problems in his own world. And so if we gave Steve work from Europe, maybe there'd be 750,000 farmers still waiting for their first bank account. So we found a way that we can find synergy with companies in Africa and companies in Europe in a way that benefits both of us without implying that we necessarily trade with each other. We just partner with each other and learn from each other and benefit. And this isn't a coincidence. And when we started this, we really didn't know what would happen. We just thought it would be good if we could move people into that middle ground, fill that gap, the capability gap. Economists have studied this. There's two guys from Harvard University, Porter and Kramer, in 2011 wrote a paper about the fact that companies who invest in socially beneficial projects tend to do commercially better as well, and certainly that's what we found. And so we want to do more of that. And so we've, just last week, we've started a new project with a different German government agency, GIZ, where we want to encourage more companies to do this. And we want to find projects and problems in Africa that can be solved or helped with ICT and software. We want to find more African companies in more African countries who want to work on that to solve that problem. And we want to find more companies in Europe who are interested in participating and mentoring and helping with the project management, and so that together we can all benefit more. The work we do in this way fits the criteria for fair trade, and therefore we're calling it fair trade software to put a recognisable label on it, and so people know that this is rather different to simple offshore outsourcing. That's the end of my story. I'd like to say thank you to all of you for listening to it and for coming along today. I'd like to thank the German government for the help they've provided us over the last couple of years. And I'd really like it if people can join in on this, and so you can find me online. Thank you. Thanks.